And a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club. And I'm going to immediately welcome my guest for the next hour, Dr. David Starkey. David, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Now, David has written the most fantastic book. It's called Crown and Country, subtitled The Kings and Queens of England, A History. It's published by Harper Press at £14.99 in paperback.
A bargain.
It might sound a lot for a paperback, but it's got a massive... How many pages has it got? 500-odd pages, so I think it does qualify almost as a bargain. Now, David, you're almost, I would say, maybe obsessed is the wrong word, but you do like to write about your monarchy, don't you?
I do. I mean, I'm not a natural kind of royal watcher. I don't go gooey at the knees when the Queen appears.
Oh,
I'm not a courtier at all. I'm interested in monarchy, I suppose. This is going to sound very pretentious. I'm interested in it intellectually. Do you know what it is? It's because I'm a contrarian. Bit like you. When I was a young man, very, very, we're all young, but I'm ancient now, but when I was young, eons ago, and starting off research at Cambridge, this was the 1960s, and everybody there was doing important, big subjects, like the history of trade unionism, the rise of the left, the triumph of the Soviet Union, and I frankly thought it was all tripe. I was bored by it. It was appallingly taught. I wasn't interested in it. And so I decided I was interested in another world. I was interested in the world of monarchy and aristocracy, which, after all, had run Western civilization for 1,500 years. And I wanted to know about that. And so I set myself to work on that. And I can still remember sweet friends saying to me, you'll never get a job. You'll be unemployed, are you doing terribly the wrong thing? And nowadays, as I sail past their clapped-out ex-polytechnic, a little royal wave.
And one of the things that I think you just managed to do, not just in your books, but in your TV documentaries, you just managed somehow to bring it to life. And I was talking about you to someone the other day, and they said, well, I don't know what it is about David Starkey. I can't put my finger on it, but he just makes me interested in whatever he's talking about. Can you put your finger on that?
Oh, gosh. I think some of it must be that I have been, oddly enough, a teacher all my life. I took my first class at Cambridge at the ripe age of 23, immediately after I graduated. And I made, it would surprise nobody who watched Jamie's Dream School, made the person I was supervising cry. And I was so ashamed of myself. Big, strapping rugger player. And he hadn't done very well, and he felt I'd humiliated him. We then became best friends. But it was one of those moments you remember. And if you teach the way I do, I teach by questioning. I teach by asking people things, trying to get them to think. And what you're trying to do is to get them to share your thought process. Now, I think that's intrinsically exciting. And as so much television is so banal, it's got absolutely no ideas in it at all, and a great deal of popular historical writing has got no ideas in it. And then there are simple techniques, which, again, I think I used to always to do, but doing a lot of television has made me much more self-conscious about them. History, the sort of history I was talking about when I was at Cambridge, had forgotten the essentials. It had forgotten people. It had forgotten events.
And in a sense, history is all about people, isn't it?
People and storytelling. So the two key elements are biography and narrative. Whereas the history that I was sort of spoon-fed at Cambridge, it was abstract nouns. There's a wonderful moment in one of the P.G. Wodehouse novels. He's got a thing about ants, these dreadful creatures, and he describes aunt calling to aunt, like brontosauruses across the primeval swamp. Well, the history I did at Cambridge, it was abstract noun. Class, hierarchy, bureaucracy, talking to abstract noun, class, hierarchy, bureaucracy. There were no events, there were no people. And I violently reacted against it. I can still remember my tutor, Geoffrey Elton, who was my research, became my research supervisor, and he was very good and very kind to me when I was in his special subject class in his third year. But he wrote this extraordinary, deeply implausible book that argued that there was a revolutioning government in Tudor England, led by a certain man called Thomas Cromwell, that Hilary Mantel has made famous. Hilary's book, really, is Geoffrey Elton translated into a novel. And he claimed, and Hilary sort of does too, that Thomas Cromwell revolutionised England, made it modern, made monarchy redundant, because it introduced this strange thing called bureaucracy. Now, I always used to tell my students, never use bureaucracy because you can't spell it. But I was utterly convinced that this was wrong. Can you imagine the moment a minister went up to Henry VIII and said, "Oi, mate, you're redundant"? I think it was the day before he had his head cut.
Yes, I was going to say the consequences would have been interesting.
Would have been probably were, yes.
Looking at your book, one of the things that is fascinating about it is that you don't do what so many history books do when they talk about kings and queens and have a chapter on each one. You actually sort of bring them together. Why did you decide to do it in that way?
Because otherwise it just becomes a telephone directory. Yeah. Bearing in mind how many there were, 20-odd, even just going back to the Norman Conquest, you just have a kind of, born, married, children died. What I was trying to do was to have the biographical element. I hope I tell lots and lots of really, really good stories about them because they're wonderful and interesting characters. But I was trying also to talk about how monarchy operates as a form of government. So it's as much about monarchy as monarchs. It's about how England is ruled and why, and what the consequences are, and why, on the whole, compared with almost all European countries, we've had rather a benign history. I mean, if you look at it's something we've forgotten because we so enjoy flagellating ourselves. But if you look at the history...
Speak for yourself.
I was using it as a collective and figurative.
Okay.
Yes. But the history of England in the 20th century, compare it with France or Germany or Spain or Russia. It's a very gentle, rather uneventful story. And we don't have ourselves to thank for that. We have our history and the institutions. And what I'm trying to do in that book is to show how they were shaped. And monarchy, of course, is the only institution, apart from the church, which is now really dead and gone, having rediscovered Christianity, catastrophic for the Church of England. But the monarchy is the only continuous institution. It's the only thing that's there right at the beginning and is still there now. And that gives you a wonderful thread on which to hang it all.
And when was right at the beginning? Because I suppose we go back to sort of Ethelred the Unready and all those characters.
Much further than that. I mean, you've got really, I think, Ian, you've got two beginnings. And what I try to do in the book is to make this clear. Britain, England, like all Western Europe, was once part of the Roman Empire. And that's the thing that finally lies at the base of our civilization. But Britain is very different from all of the other provinces of the Western Empire, in that if you go to France, if you go to Spain, if you go to Italy, there an awful lot of Rome still survives. The languages are still debased forms of Latin. The road systems are often very closely related to the great Roman roads. You even have the bridges and the aqueducts you've got in bits of France. The field boundaries have survived over those 2,000 years. The main towns are still largely the same. Place names are Roman. If you go to England, there's hardly any of that. Obviously, our language is not based on Latin. Our language is a Germanic language. It's overlaid with Latin and French later. Again, the Roman towns, by and large, disappear. The way England works, then, is completely different because Romanness is destroyed. And I think this is one of the fundamental and key facts in understanding English history. And it was very interesting writing this. I mean, I am no expert in this field, this very early history at all. But when I read the standard works on it, I was profoundly dissatisfied, because they were all at that point telling me, Roman Britain was just a province of the empire like every other province of the empire, and it was just as Latinate, and Rome made just, what did the Romans do for us? Well, they did as much for us as they did for everybody else. And then when I read it, and particularly when I tried to read the sources on the end of Roman Britain, it became pretty clear to me that actually that was not true, that Britain never really became Roman. If you look in France, that's Gaul, the upper class in Gaul, the natives, became fully Roman. They participated in Roman government. They became senators. They went to the centre. They became leading officers in other provinces. Nothing like that happens in Britain. And when you get a leading Gaulish nobleman writing about a friend of his who'd been governor of Britain, this is somebody who is really a Celt. But obviously, he's learned his Latin. He's absorbed Latin culture. He describes going to Britain as the equivalent of going to India under the British Empire. It's an exile. You're going into a very strange, funny, remote and foreign place where the natives are awkward. So,
a bit like Scotland.
I couldn't possibly comment. So that was one of the
I know
points.
You've got in trouble for that before.
You're leading, Ian. You're leading.
No,
me.
We might come on to that a bit later.
I think you're provoking me. I mean, it's my job to provoke.
Well, we'll come back to the development of the monarchy in this country in just a second. If you'd like to talk to David Starkey, if you've got a question that you're dying to ask him, it can be about any aspect of the monarchy, of history. Even Jamie's Dream School, if you really insist on it.
You really want to provoke him.
Indeed. 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. You can also text us, of course, on 84850. The time now is 9:15. And it's time for the LBC Travel with Alan Joyce.
Thanks, Ian. Well, we've got two big motor...
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and my guest tonight is Dr. David Starkey, the author of Crown and Country. It's published by Harper Press at $14.99 in paperback. If you have a question for David, the number to call is 0845 6060 973, and that's just what Nigel in Thamesmead has done. Hello, Nigel.
Hello, Ian. Great to speak to you, as always.
Well, thank you very much. What's your question to David?
Yeah, well, David, I've met you once before a few months ago, and I really wanted you to explain to London public about the importance of education of history to the kids of London in schools, because I've seen people think that history is access to some kind of entertainment, and I think history can help us in every shape and form: music, drama, geography, everything. And I think, please do, I've heard you talk before, please talk about how important it is for people always to understand history.
Yes, I couldn't really put it better myself, Nigel. Not so much a question as a powerful and eloquent statement. I think that history, fundamentally, all our culture is history. In other words, when you refer to our culture, what you're doing is you're referring to the huge accumulation of human experience, and that it's the duty of the older generation to pass that accumulated experience in every area, from architecture to athletics, on to the next generation. And one of the great problems at the moment, I think, is because we tend to put such emphasis on creativity and originality, we're not doing the proper task of cultural transfer. And I think that's a terrible problem, and it is leading to a terrible uprooting of our culture. And the right way to do that is by taking the historical dimension. I mean, not simply what we normally call history, but in every sphere. I mean, remember, until very recently, biology used to be called natural history, that all the sciences, particularly astronomy, are essentially historical. They're looking at what was and how what was became what we have now. So it's a particular kind of thinking, and one of the ways in which you do it most easily, readily, of course, is what we call history. But again, how are we doing it in schools? Well, you can't produce a single answer to that. Some schools do it extraordinarily well, some do it extraordinarily badly. One of the things that greatly worries me is that we've lost, Ian and I were talking when we were talking about my monarchy book. What that book is trying to do is very simply to begin at the beginning, 1500 or 2000 years ago, and go right up to now. Both school teachers and professional historians have lost that sort of confidence. Everybody says, oh, it's not my period. We have little tiny bits of knowledge. And if you look at what school children study at school, well, it's a bit of Henry VIII, a huge amount of Hitler, usually 3 or 4 times, the ancient Egyptians and the history of medicine, completely incoherent, all over the place. What we should be trying to do in the way we teach history in schools is to give people at least a map of time, where they are placed in the great big pattern of human development. And I suppose everything that I do tries to do that, but again, as we were saying at the beginning there, to do it with a sort of sugaring the pill, which, in other words, you were being a little bit despising of entertainment. Knowledge is much better when it's fun, and the use of storytelling, the use of colour, the use of biography isn't simply sugaring the pill, it is making people want to learn. And you know, there's that wonderful phrase that you could drag a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. There's no point in just presenting the young with a stolid, solid kind of meat and 2 veg diet. It's got to be made attractive to them, and it can be. And that, I suppose, is what I try to do, and what I would wish everybody who tries to teach the subject would try to do.
Well, Nigel, thank you very much for your call. Well, Jamie Oliver tried to make school dinners attractive to school kids. He's now turning his hand to this Dream School programme, which I confess I haven't actually seen, so I'm not going to be able to ask any sensible questions about it, really. But what possessed you to get involved in it in the first place? Was it because you just want to bring a knowledge, a love of history to a wider audience?
Oh, that would be putting it at the, how can we say, that would be taking a very lofty view of what happened. What really happened was my arm was twisted. It was twisted very...
By the fee?
If only. If only. If it had been twisted by the fee, it would have been the equivalent of a very light pair of tweezers, rather than an instrument of torture. I've never done so much for so little in my life. No, it was Channel 4 were very keen that I did it. Jamie, for whom I've always had a high regard. I met him right at the beginning of his success, 10 years ago, when his first cookery book won the W.H. Smith Prize, and I'd won the W.H. Smith Prize for biography for my Elizabeth book. And we were all in a line, getting prizes, and straight, the wide prizes always have to be so ugly. This vile block of glass with, some awful squiggly writing on it. Anyway, and I was disgracefully sniffy. I could not cook, writing books. He handled me beautifully. He went out of his way.
Anyway, that's enough of that.
No, it's real. Not my type at all, dear. Rather too plump. But he I have a thing about fatness, and he really was nice, he was friendly, and he forced me to be too. And from that moment onwards, I've had a lot of time for him. And then there was the element you talk about, that it seems to me, just as Nigel, our last caller, was saying, history has been on the retreat in schools. It was very important to make sure that it played a central and important part in that. It was not easy. It was not easy. I mean, the sort of children that we were trying to teach there are not, how can I put this tactfully, natural historians. They're not interested in anything outside a very, very narrow range of their own immediate experience. It was difficult to involve them. I think finally we did, but it was hard work. Very hard.
What was the high point and low point?
The low point was the first class, and it was the whole beginning of Dream School was a catastrophe. it was very typical of television. I don't know how much television you've done. In television, everybody concentrates on total inessentials. They had agonised about what colour the walls should be painted, what the sofas should be and how they should be arranged in the staff room. Should there be potted plants in the staff lavatory? All that kind of thing. Nobody had thought for 1 second of the colour of the school tie. Nobody had thought for 1 second what a school is, how a school works, what is the difference between a good school and a bad school. And above all, it had Jamie at its heart. And Jamie is brilliantly good at many things, and for example, is 15, works superbly as a rescue operation for young people. Because, of course, a kitchen is like a military operation. To run a kitchen is brutal. And when Jamie is in charge of a kitchen, nice Jamie goes out of the window. And, you know, the name for a group of chefs is a brigade. Chef, mon chef, you know, it's the French. It's my leader. And that was why that worked in the same way the Michel Roux programme served, is, you know, serving a meal, is intense discipline. Jamie in a school, of course, hopeless, all over the place, oozing the milk of human kindness, and he was unfortunately aided and abetted by this absolutely catastrophic headmaster, who came from the heart of the soppy left educational establishment and just was a catastrophe. We know what's needed in schools. It's a gentle but firm framework of discipline, so that those who want to learn, and those who don't want to learn at least shut up. And, you know, there was none of that there. So it began, to put it like this, it wasn't even organised chaos. It was chaos and bedlam and hell.
Well, if you've got a question about Jamie's Dream School that you'd like to ask David, he's here for the next half an hour. But I'd also quite like you to ask him questions about his book, because I've singularly failed to do so over the last 10 minutes. But we will rectify that very shortly. 0845 6060 973 is the number to call.
London's biggest conversation. Dale.
And Nick Abbott is sitting in for Clive Bull this evening from 10. He's joined us in the studio. Nick, what's on the programme tonight?
It boggles my tiny mind to know where to begin, Ian.
Well, my mind is permanently boggled.
I thought it was just the look on your face. Only 7% of senior bankers are women. Why aren't more women in the boardrooms of our biggest companies? Have you ever traded without money? Have you ever successfully complained about a product or services? Banks, again, the most complained about thing that we use. When did you notice you were becoming like your parents? What unusual or accidental uses have you found for ordinary household products or objects? The superglue fella who invented it by accident has just died. What do you think of the idea of a mansion tax? How do you plan the perfect stag do? What is irritating about modern life? Apparently people were trying to fill the census form out online, and when they stood up to make a cup of tea, they got logged off and had to start at the beginning again. And do we talk ourselves down too much? There you are.
Well, there's a royal link there with stag do's, isn't there? So Harry and William have just been on the stag do, which we might talk about in a second and give you a nice little lead in.
I shall enjoy that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick Abbott will be here at 10 o'clock. Now, just in the news, David, I should remind you, I'm here with David Starkey, the author of Crown and Country, as part of the LBC Book Club Hour. David, we were talking about balaclavas, as you do, during the news, and you wanted to give us some insight into the use of balaclavas, because, of course, a lot
not
of
so much balaclavas, but the covering of the face.
Yes.
The Home Secretary has just indicated that it's going to be illegal. It always was illegal for exactly this reason. There was legislation right through the late Middle Ages, the early modern period. You mustn't be hooded when you are hunting. In other words, you mustn't be trying to conceal your face for exactly the reason that we've seen when these people with impunity, smash banks, windows, and all the rest of it. It was always illegal. So it'll be very interesting if that law can be enforced.
Back to the future again.
Back to the future, as so often. Our ancestors got it right.
Now, we've actually only started to scratch the surface of your book, because the last question I asked you was about the first monarch and how the monarchy came into being. Just in a few seconds, just take us through the development of the monarchy up to your specialist period, the Tudor period.
Gosh, well,
challenge.
kingship sort of comes into England rather backwards. It doesn't derive directly from the power of Roman emperors. It seems to come in because, of course, England is actually invaded. We are a creation of another invasion, of an Anglo-Saxon invasion. Our remote ancestors coming from North Germany, southern Denmark, that area there, and they seem not to have had kingship, or not really much form of direct political organisation. And they were rather levelling societies. All males were armed with the ordinary people with spears, the more aristocratic with swords. And of course, a group of armed men is something it's very difficult to impose authority upon. Leadership seems to have been elective, seems to have been by choice, and it placed obviously very, very heavy emphasis on warrior skills and this kind of thing. So kingship in England, as far as we can tell, seems very much to have come up from the bottom. It seems to have, as it were, it was popular, whereas, of course, the Roman model, which is very much true of all of continental Europe, it comes from the top. It claims authority from God or whatever. And English kingship is a very, very different sort of thing. And right going back to the moment at which England becomes England, in which the warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms come together under the leadership of the Kingdom of Wessex, and you get in the 9th century the great coronation of Edgar, the first really fully recorded English coronation. It's extraordinarily modern. It's very much recognisably, even some of the verses that they use are the same as in the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, which is one of my great vivid memories as a boy. But it always begins with the king swearing oaths to his people. Now, this is very different, for example, from the French monarchy, where in France the king swore an oath to his crown. He swore an oath to preserve the powers of the monarchy. In England, you didn't. You swore to observe the laws of the people. And this is there from a very, very early stage. So in England, as it were, powerful though kings were, extraordinary though many of them were, amazingly talented Plantagenet dynasty, there was always a distinction between the king and the kingdom, between the king and his people. And there was a very clear notion that finally the king answers to his people. And you see this, you talked about Ethelred the Unready, there's the actual settlement, a kind of ancestor of Magna Carta, an agreement. Ethelred was a dreadful king. What's really interesting, Ian, is bad kings are at least as important as good kings, because bad kings are the ones who strain the political process to breaking point. And if you look at how notions of liberty and responsibility and responsible government develop, the bad kings, Ethelred the Unready, King John, Charles I, they're the ones under whom the most interesting developments take place, which means the book isn't just triumphalist, you know. It's not just saying great monarchy, isn't monarchy wonderful. It's saying, well, actually, look at how it works.
Who was the worst king?
Who was the worst king? Probably, I suspect, Richard III. Let's tread on lots of toes with that. He is the most brutal, the most pointlessly murderous of monarchs. And of course, he destroys what had promised to be an extraordinarily successful dynasty, his own, the House of York. And if you look at what a king should be, is protecting and prolonging his dynasty. Well, instead, he leads it to suicide.
I didn't know you were going to say Richard III, and this is pure coincidence, but we actually have a caller, Ronnie, who's in St Paul's, who has a question on Richard III. Ronnie, go ahead.
Yeah, hello there, lads.
Hello.
I just want to ask David what he's put in his book about Richard III, because he's obviously our most maligned monarch, and the theory about he killed the princes has never sat very well with me. I always thought that Henry Tudor had much more to gain by the demise of those young lads than what Richard did. What do you think, David?
I think you're wrong, to put it in a word. I think that Richard III had everything to gain from killing them. I mean, what's very striking in this period, and it's a bit, I mean, we've had a very interesting example, haven't we, with the two millibands, the two millipedes. When the two brothers fought each other, you've got to put a knife firmly through the shoulder blades. You get rid of them. Exactly that happens with Richard III, or with anybody who usurps the throne. You cannot leave your predecessor alive. They're too dangerous. You've got to get rid of them. And it's very clear what Richard intended to do when he not simply gets rid of the elder of his two nephews, of the little boy Edward V, the former Prince of Wales. He then deliberately gets his hands on the younger brother, the Duke of York. He wants to make sure that the whole of the alternative succession is out of the way. So, I mean, I'm afraid Richard had an awful lot to gain from getting rid of those boys. Otherwise, there were lots and lots of people who would support them. And you see, again, Ronnie, the reason that Richard's government falls to pieces is that supporters of the House of York, and Richard, of course, was the Prince of the House of York, were so appalled by the displacement of Edward V and whatever happened to him in the Tower, and the similar treatment of his brother, Richard, Duke of York, that they actually turn against Richard. Richard III. There was, remember, by 1483, there was no Yorkist following in England. Edward IV had completely destroyed the House of York in two of the greatest and most terrible battles of our history. First at the Battle of Towton, and then at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Every royal prince of the rival house, apart from Henry Tudor, had been destroyed. So there was no Yorkist party. So who is it that rises against Richard III? Ex-Yorkists, who are so appalled by what he's done to Edward IV's children that they turn against him.
Ronnie, thank you very much for asking that question. Do you think our current monarch, our beloved Queen, has any qualities of the old Tudor monarchs?
Oh, no. I mean, the Tudor monarchs, they're like me. The Tudor monarchs are strident. They're vulgar, they're assertive, they're domineering. The idea that any Tudor would have remained absolutely silent for 60 years.
But she's done it so well.
She's perfectly. But the idea that they could have contained their wrath and rage, I mean, can you imagine what she really thought about Diana? I don't think a Henry VIII, or above all an Elizabeth I, would have kept quiet. We would have known. And it would have been delivered in a magnificent, rhetorically forceful, mounting tirade of rage. The poor Queen, you know, she's institutionalised long-suffering silence. I mean, look at those dreadful speeches she has to read out in Parliament. I mean, they're not only just dull, they're not only are most of the proposals normally absurd, they're written so badly. It's very interesting, if you go back to the days of royal power, the king or queen did not read the speech at the opening of Parliament. They sat magnificently on the throne whilst the Lord Chancellor read the speech. It's only once the monarch has been turned into a cipher that they deliver that speech. Yeah.
What links the modern day monarchy and, say, the Tudor monarchy? I mean, tradition, I suppose, is just the name. It's as simple as that.
But, well, it's also that we, and again, it's one of the great strengths of Britain, we are brilliant at pouring new wine into old bottles. And in some ways, everything is the same. I mean, you know, your area of politics, legislation, this kind of thing. If you look at how an Act of Parliament becomes law, if you look at the actual enacting clause, the thing that determines that it is a law, that it shifts from being a bill, a proposal, to an act which is legally binding, the phrase that's used is exactly that's used under the Tudors. Still, be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent majesty, with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal in this present, and Commons in this present Parliament assembled that. You see, it's a wonderful rolling, but of course it's changed its meaning completely. in the Tudor period, the royal assent, what really was the thing that animated the legislation. No monarch has dared to exercise the veto since Queen Anne. The crown, of course, we still call it the crown imperial. That's the name that was given to the Tudor crown. Parliament still meets at Westminster, as Parliament has always met at Westminster. The power centre of everyday government is what it was under Henry VIII. There's something it's Whitehall. Henry VIII's Palace of Whitehall, now vanished and overlaid with modern government buildings. I mean, it's absolutely staggering how the sense of place is still there. Downing Street, the nerve centre of modern government, is a few hundred feet from Henry VIII's bedroom.
Is that right?
The great core of Henry VIII's Palace of Whitehall stretched from the river through the Ministry of Defence right across to St James's Park, and inside those governmental buildings there are still the remains of quite a few of the buildings of Henry VIII's palace, including my favourite. The area of the Treasury is where the cockpit was, which seems entirely appropriate.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Dr. David Starkey, who's written a fantastic book, Crown and Country, published this week, $14.99. In paperback, we'll be hearing more from David in a couple of minutes' time. It's 9:45. And here's Alan Joyce with the travel.
Thanks, Ian. Well, a number of problems on the road to see.
Shawaz in Streatham has texted to say, Ian, I could listen to David all day. His knowledge is never ending. A superb guest. Well, who are we talking about? David Starkey. He's with me throughout this hour on the LBC Book Club because he's written a book called Crown and Country, The Kings and Queens of England, a History. It's a very different kind of history. It's not just a chapter on one king, a chapter on another. It kind of weaves the whole story of the monarchy together, and that's really the point you were making, David, isn't it? That history is all about a story.
Yes, and obviously there's a story in everybody's mind at the moment because we're a few weeks away from the royal wedding of the new century, Kate and William, or Catherine and William as we're now supposed to call her.
Are we really? Who said
I think
that?
there's been a kind of nudge. All the official announcements have been Catherine. Clearly it's going to be
right.
Princess Catherine of Wales, whatever she's going to be. And what I tried to do in the introduction to this edition of the book is to look at royal marriages. Again, taking this idea of going right through a long stretch of time. The standard remark about Kate and William getting married is really horribly snobbish. It's all about, how her mother was an air hostess, this business. It's alleged that Harry's naughty friends refer to Mrs. Middleton Senior as, doors to manual, and really really very, very, very disapprovable. And there's a dreadful snobbery about it, and the popular press has been going on, isn't it amazing, somebody who descends from a line of Durham miners, marries Prince of the Royal Blood and all the rest. Actually, this is going back to old English custom, that if you look at that great monarchy of the Plantagenets and the Tudors, it is astonishing how many of them marry non-royally.
They liked a bit of rough.
They're not so much rough. My nicest example is John of Gaunt, the great Duke of Lancaster, who his estates are still they're still the jewel of the crown. I mean, there's still the things that keep everybody in the style to which they're accustomed. And John of Gaunt marries his au pair. His third wife, Catherine Roe, is very modest family in the Netherlands, and her sister marries, of all people, the great poet Geoffrey Chaucer. So the greatest royal duke in England is brother-in-law to a citizen of London and a customer and a jobbing, in other words, somebody working in the customs, and a jobbing poet. Now, no other country in Europe would that be possible. We also seem in that period to invent the idea that love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage. Of course, the French are wonderfully romantic, but they never dream of marrying the person that they love. And so that was the sort of really in many ways, strikingly modern practice in England in the late Middle Ages. And then, of course, what happens, Ian, is we get all that you were referring to bloody foreigners. We get all these foreigners. We get the Scots and we get the Germans as royal dynasties in the 17th, 18th and 19th century. And they've got completely different marriage customs. The Germans, essentially, insist that you have to marry your exact social equal and that you have to keep on marrying Germans. So, in fact, the British royal family, the Hanoverians, they're a bit like a modern Punjabi immigrant, you know. They insist on marrying back home every generation. So they're just as German at the beginning of the 20th century as they were at the beginning of the 18th. Unfortunately then, of course, or perhaps fortunately, we have a little thing called the First World War, when we're fighting the Germans, led, incidentally, by Queen Victoria's eldest and favourite grandson, the German Kaiser. And suddenly, the English royal house, which God knows what it was called Guelph, was it called Wettin, was it called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, reinvents itself as English. It's one of the great years of our history which we've forgotten about. It's 1917, you invent the House of Windsor, and you change the marriage customs. For the first time, George V and Queen Mary decree their children could marry English men and English women, and everything changes. At that point, you can present a royal wedding as a popular romance. You change the venue. Before that point, royal weddings never take place in Westminster Abbey. Only one earlier royal wedding ever took place in St. Paul's, and that's Henry VIII's elder brother, Arthur, and Queen Catherine, and the bridegroom is dead within sort of 4 months of the wedding. They should have looked at that precedent in 1981, shouldn't they? But from 1917 onwards, these marriages become national marriages, so they take place in the Abbey. So in other words, it seems to me that Kate's marriage, Catherine's marriage, is in this new tradition. It's in this, if you like, it's coming round full circle, as history so often does. It's going back to the very relaxed practices of the English monarchy in the late Middle Ages. It's social mix. It's clearly playing around with ideas of love. Of course, the novelty of it is, and it would have been unthinkable in any previous age, that they've actually lived together. And they've lived apart, and then they've got back together again, which is why I, for one, am relatively optimistic about it. You know, if you contrast it with the catastrophe of Charles and Diana's marriage, you remember, it's not all that long ago, but there was all this business of whisper, you know, she's got to be a virgin. I mean, ludicrous. This is not like that, and it's equal. After all, he was Eton, she was Marlborough. They meet at the same university, reading the same subject. You watch her perform at the press conference. It's not like the young Diana with Charles. She's not all shy and girlish. She was relaxed, she was confident. She was the one who actually looked much more in charge. It was William who was sort of stuttering and hesitant. I think it all bodes rather well. But who am I to be a marriage? Who are we to be marriage guidance counsellors, Ian?
Indeed, this is true. Now, I never understand why you've been called the rudest man in Britain, because whenever I've met you, you've been charm personified. Indeed, you have been this evening. But well, you did call the Queen a provincial housewife once. Now, when you showed her round an exhibition on Elizabeth I, did you bring that up at all, or was she too polite?
No. That it was after that.
It was
I'm afraid I use that. Because, of course, what I was trying to emphasise
we have a couple of minutes left. So.
Okay, right. She was clearly bored out of her head. This was an exhibition on the greatest of her ancestors, Elizabeth I. She obviously was not interested at all. She wore a horrible citron yellow suit, which clashed horribly with the red decorations of the place. She marched in. She wasn't in a terribly good mood. She hadn't had what she wanted to drink at lunch, or rather it had been, well, which we won't discuss, it had been heavily delayed. She marched past all these wonderful pieces of armour that I'd laboured like mad to put together, and she then stopped in front of the picture of the young Elizabeth, which we'd got from Windsor, and she turned to Philip, little beckon. Philip trots over. Philip, isn't this mine? That was all she said as she went round the damn exhibition, apart from when I gave up at that point, and somebody else took over, except at the end we were getting to that hideous portrait of Elizabeth wearing parliamentary robes, which were all held together by bows. And she asked the person showing her round at that point, why the bows? And he said, I'm afraid I don't know, you'll have to ask Dr. Starkey, at which point her face fell. And so I began by saying, well, I don't want to bore you, Mum. No, you're not boring us now. And I explained it was because royal dress then was held together, as it were, sleeves were separate, bodice separate, skirts separate, and they were all held together by ties that were called points. And at the end of that she said, oh, just like the Garter. I hate the Garter robes. And that was it. Not a great sensitivity of history. She's many qualities, but an intellectual she ain't.
Well, what a moment to end on. David, you've been a wonderful guest. David's book is Crown and Country, published by HarperCollins, $14.99 in paperback. Nick Abbott's next. This is LBC 97.3.
On a train with a good